We're coming to you from Foggy Bottom in Washington, D.C., our nation's capital. I'm not Lacey Brusky. She's out today, but I'm Drew, if you remember, and I'm joined by my friends and fellow international affairs colleagues, Kevin Ferdosi, Grace Chesson, and today we have a special friend, Siree Allers, who's also a classmate in our program. Say hi, Siree.
Hi, Drew.
Say hi, Kevin.
Hello.
And Grace is not with us right at this moment. But today we'd like to discuss illicit oil networks. So when we started researching this topic and we Googled illicit oil networks, the only thing that came up was ISIL, ISIS, the Islamic State, Daesh, whatever you want to call it. And clearly this is a big issue for related to ISIS and their spread. But illicit oil smuggling has existed long before the rise of ISIS, and it exists in many other places beyond just Iraq and the Levant. So today we're going to talk a little bit about ISIL, and our friend Siree is going to help us with that, and we're hopefully going to move beyond and talk about the smuggling that occurs in other parts of the world beyond Iraq and Syria. So Siree, start us off. What is ISIS doing in the oil smuggling world?
So I think there are two ways to approach this. There are some major questions to ask, and that is whether these oil networks are a symptom of a problem or whether they're a problem in itself. Regarding the ISIS issue, there are several reasons to think this is important, and that's for security reasons, in that to eradicate ISIS, you need to eradicate their source of funding. Also, there are governance issues, and this ties into whether this is a problem in itself or not. The governance issue is that even after ISIS is eradicated at some point in the future, these illicit networks are going to continue to exist. And then the third major question is the humanitarian element, that so much of the Syrian economy has been cornered by ISIS and other groups that civilians are being pulled into these illicit networks because they see no other option. I'm sorry, just on top of that, also in trying to interdict these efforts, these networks, you have to try to cut it off without cutting off major networks of trade and starving thousands of civilians in the process.
So, Siree, you one of the first things you mentioned that I keyed in on was that this is a major source of funding for ISIS. And first of all, what should I call ISIS, just for this conversation? Because I'm not someone who pays attention to this region as much as I should.
So I personally prefer calling them Daesh.
Daesh?
You can say Daesh.
Daesh?
D-A-S-H. You can call it Daesh.
Okay.
And the reason is because so much of the influence they exert is psychological and it's media-based, that I think what you call them really matters. And so using this name that they don't like makes a small difference. That said, I'll adhere to whatever name is normally being used for just to make things simpler in most mediums.
I like Daesh. So if this is a major source of funding for them, crippling this source of funding would be significant in the fight against Daesh and its spread. So how important is this source of funding for them? Just broadly speaking.
Yeah, it's really difficult to say because a lot of numbers have been thrown out there, but you never know what's actually based on studies and what's speculation. And I mean, in the bubble of DC and ISIS discourse, you have a lot of people who kind of sensationalize the issue for their own reasons. But it's also very important just generally because as they try to make claims of being a proto-state, their ability to fund themselves and offer services to the people in the territories they govern are a metric for whether they can actually function as a state.
That's interesting. Okay, so this is important for Daesh as a state, but has oil smuggling been occurring in Iraq, in this region? Iraq, Syria, what we'll call Kurdistan, southern Turkey. Surely this has been going on for longer than Daesh has been around, right?
It has been. It's also important to realize that ISIS didn't create this vast network. It's not like this all just leapt onto the scene. Just as ISIS is kind of a reformation of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, these networks existed before. They existed, under the Ottoman period. People used to smuggle narcotics. When the mandate system was put in place, it cut villages in half. That created ideal cross-border smuggling relationships. And then under Saddam became really tight with the smugglers because of the sanctions, and that was one of the few ways to get oil out.
So Saddam was, and what time period was Saddam? When did he start his, I guess, reign essentially? Like when did he come to power? Early 70s, right? Obviously
sure,
to the early 2000s. So was he sanctioning, or was he at least looking the other way?
He was actually involved very closely in the smuggling because he was sanctioned after the Gulf War, kind of in the 90s. He was sanctioned by the international community, and he was increasingly sanctioned. So he was looking for ways to get around that sanction, make a profit from his oil industry. And he did that by smuggling things out. He became very close with the smugglers. And then AQI eventually co-opted that network. And then AQI became ISIS.
Interesting. Okay, so that leads me to another question that I had about smuggling in general. So in your experience looking at Iraq...
When I smuggle...
when we all smuggle... So in your experience looking at this issue in Iraq in particular with oil smuggling, do you see these routes or these networks being used to smuggle more than just oil, both during Saddam and after?
You do have certain overlaps. I haven't looked at that as closely, but it's, in Syria right now, because there is no existing, strong functioning economy, you have food commodities and other things being smuggled between Turkey and Syria as well. And so that's part of the concern for, cutting off a lot of these oil smuggling networks could also cut off essential trade flows, smuggling flows, but of important goods that are critical to the civilian population there.
Interesting. So let's talk about the smugglers themselves, like the people actually moving the stuff along these routes. Will one family or one organization or one individual, will they move more than just oil like themselves? Like, so if I have been taking oil from point A to point B across a certain route, might I also be persuaded to take other things like food or whatever else I feel like there's a market for at point B? And I'm speaking specifically to like what you've seen in Iraq.
I haven't necessarily seen that happening with my research on oil smuggling. What's struck me is the many ways in which the oil is exported. So there are pictures here of oil smuggling taking place through, like, by tying a whole bunch of barrels of oil to donkeys, or putting them on boats and then floating them over, or just hiding them in trucks. What's surprising is that this is sensationalized and seems like a very complex network, but it's actually pretty simple. It just takes place at a very large scale. Interesting.
Let's move beyond Iraq though, because I think a lot of, like we said at the beginning, a lot of the reporting, a lot of the public knowledge about this issue kind of focuses on Iraq and Syria, the connection to Daesh, its use of oil smuggling to fund its governance. And its existence. But I think oil smuggling happens, like any other kind of smuggling or illicit activity around the world, where there exists a supply and there exists a demand and there exists a way to get around regulations or law enforcement, right? So what are these places? Kevin, you and I were talking about this a little earlier.
Yeah, so if we start off with looking at the Middle East, right? You have in Syria, for example, the Al-Nusra Front, basically Al-Qaeda in Syria, who have taken control of some of the oil fields and are smuggling into Turkey, right? In certain cases, even Turkish officials supposedly have been involved in this. And what's interesting is, Al-Nusra Front's been able to take advantage of the political instability in Syria in order to smuggle this oil, whereas if you had a stable state, that might not be as easy to do. And you end up having people whose livelihoods depend on the oil smuggling, right? So because their livelihoods depend on this, there's disincentive for stabilization of the state, right? So post-conflict, I was reading a really interesting article by Matt Herbert talking about this. We'll post it up on the show notes, talking about how you have entities, whether these are individuals or it's becoming powerful enough to where these people can build and maintain militias as well, and they have an incentive to keep the conflict going on, because if the state stabilizes, then they'll be out of business, basically. So that's looking at Syria. But interestingly, I mean, we talked about a couple of other regions, Mexico and Southeast Asia. If I can talk a little bit about Southeast Asia first, because a phenomenon that's happening right there right now is a big increase in piracy. And you always think of Somalia as being the prime spot for piracy, or the Horn of Africa in general. But apparently, in the last couple of years, about half of the piracy has taken place in Southeast Asia, which I had no idea until I started doing this research. So you look at particularly Malaysia, Singapore is a big one, and a lot of this piracy, or the majority of this piracy, is actually the target is oil bunkering. So basically, you go in and you're either stealing oil that's already been drilled, or you're drilling into pipelines and then siphoning off the oil.
Now, to go back to Siree real quick, we were talking about oil smuggling in Iraq. Is this tapping pipes, or is this like digging it literally out of the ground and then barreling it up yourself and then putting it on the back of a mule and walking it somewhere?
This is plugging into the networks that already exist. And so,
Okay.
So I mean, it's a little bit of both. And you don't, so it's a matter of ISIS taking control of these larger scale refineries in Syria and some in Iraq. But it's also, you can kind of create your own refineries, refine the oil on your own.
Now, is this so people are buying it from smugglers who smuggled crude to them and then building their own refineries and doing it, or are some people like drilling their own crude and then refining their own crude?
Both.
Interesting.
So yeah, you have it taking place on the individual level, like individuals refining it themselves and then transporting it themselves, but also I'll have ISIS selling to these middlemen, and then the middlemen taking it across, and then Daesh will just charge them along the routes. So Daesh makes a profit at a lot of different points in the process.
How would you compare the kind of the structure and the actors involved between, looking at the drug smuggling in Mexico and the kind of the cross-border aspect of it, and then also looking at the illicit oil traffic in the Middle East?
Right, so Suri wasn't here for the drug smuggling episode, so I'll give you a little bit of background about that, and then maybe you can jump in, Suri. So it turns out that cartels, particularly the Zetas and the Gulf Cartel, have been diversifying, right? So we talked about how they started off with drugs, but they started moving into human smuggling, and most recently, in the last couple of years, they've started doing the same thing with oil. So they go in and they have these, hundreds of pipelines across the country, and they drill into them, and then they siphon off the oil into trucks, and then ship them across into Texas or along the Texas-Mexico border, up to, like, some estimates say billions of dollars per year, right? And they're using the exact same networks that they have. We talked about how cartels are kind of more shipping companies more than they are, or network companies more than they are drug companies. So they're using the same networks that they do for drugs, for people, as they are now for oil.
So who are they selling the oil to in the U.S.? Maybe this is a bad question.
Yeah, I mean,
good question.
It's hard to say. Now, you have to have, obviously, middlemen. And if I can go back to Southeast Asia as well, you have fixers, right? Middlemen who are making the oil. They have actual employed forgers who make the oil seem legitimate, and then they're able to sell it into legitimate markets, right? So in Southeast Asia, most of the oil is going to China. But then if you look at the Mexican border, some of the oil is being sold to gas stations along the border. Others are actually being shipped into the United States, into Texas, and being sold to refineries. I can't remember the name of a refinery right now, but there's one in Houston that was indicted a couple of years ago because it turns out that they were knowingly buying oil that was smuggled across the border, illegally drilled, and the tax money was returned to the Mexican government. I mean, this is millions and millions of dollars. It makes sense if you are, an unscrupulous company, you're buying oil at a discount because it's illegal.
So this is interesting though, because this issue obviously hits closer to home. We started with Iraq, talking about Daesh, ISIS, call it what you will.
Yeah, it looks like basically wherever there's oil, especially in an unstable state, wherever there's oil, there's going to be oil smuggling.
Well, yeah, I mean that's what there seems to be. There's a model here which is not. It's based more on where is their oil, right? Where's their instability? So barriers to entry for an illicit market are low, right? And there is a demand. And if your oil supply is conveniently located to other, smuggling routes, shipping routes, if it's logistically convenient, then oil smuggling, the illicit oil network, will probably be there. Will probably exist, right? So we're looking at Mexico, into the United States, which is crazy. I never would have thought, right? We started this episode off, in the Middle East. But no, this issue exists and has tendrils into Houston. The issue too with a lot of these cartels stealing oil in Mexico and shipping it, north to the U.S. They probably do not, and I may be speculating here, but they probably do not have a lot of concern for the environment in these cases. So what are they? I mean, they're tapping pipelines, and oftentimes they're leaving before the federales can get to them, and oftentimes they just leave the hole in the pipe with the oil just spurting out onto the ground. And 2010 there was an explosion in Puebla in which cartel members trying to extract, I believe it was Zetas, were trying to extract oil from a pipeline, didn't do it properly and caused an explosion. It killed them and killed others. So I mean, this is also a massive problem. The environmental degradation from unregulated, secret, illicit theft of oil.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, these people have few scruples, right? They're here. It's like we talked about last time. They're doing. It's about making money, right? And they'll sell oil if that's what's lucrative, or drugs if that's what's lucrative, or human smuggling if that's what's lucrative. They're in it for the money, right? And I don't think they're not very green people.
Well,
that's what you're asking.
I think a distinction should be made though between criminals who are doing something criminal and people who are victims of structures beyond themselves that are engaging in criminal activities to survive. Because I think some of these families in Iraq sometimes that pull oil out of the ground and sell it to smugglers or whatever, I mean, they're doing that for daily bread right now because they can't, right? They can't make income other ways.
You have fighters who were part of the original liberal coalition against Assad, who were fighting Assad.
Bashar al-Assad.
In fighting Bashar al-Assad, fighting Daesh, and because haven't gotten enough support, they didn't get enough support early on, and they've kind of dissipated in a lot of ways. Some of them are now part of this illicit oil network because they didn't have a chance earlier, and now this is the only way to make money. So you have fighters who were previously fighting Daesh now helping to fund them, and they realize this as well. They're aware, but they just don't see any other option for themselves.
Yeah, that's an important distinction to make. I mean, that's in a lot of crime. There are people participating in the crime who are victims. There are people who are victims that are also pushing the crime forward, and I think it's important to not just broad brush, particularly smugglers of oil in this particular sense with this one color of bad,
right?
Not to lighten the severity of the situation in which in the case of like we were just discussing in Mexico, a lot of these cartels are engaged in very bad things. This is one of them, and their engagement in this particular activity is just as bad as the way they engage in all their other activities. And the victim, the damage done to the environment, to human lives, to the economy in their area is not to be sneezed at.
But even within Mexico, I should say, these are vast networks. It's in Southeast Asia as well. This is organized crime, and you have the leaders, but then you also have these middlemen. But then when you get down to it, there are people who have really no connection, no direct connection with the people who are ordering everything, and they're participating in oil smuggling or drilling or siphoning because it's their livelihood and they have no choice, right? And in a lot of cases, like there was one case in Mexico where they had, probably 5-10 people who would dig into the ground, and then a couple people with knowledge who would drill in and siphon, and then they all leave, and the police find out, which usually doesn't happen, but the police were able to get to them, and they get there, and the only person left is the poor guy who's driving the truck and waiting for the tank to finish filling. This guy is obviously he's engaging in illicit activity, but he's not some kingpin. He's a guy who is probably just trying to put food on the table for his family.
The scope of this in some places should be noted as well. I'm not sure we didn't really go into detail in terms of the what's going on in Nigeria, for example, which is also a major source of smuggling. But one of the sources that we did use from the Africa Economic Development Institute, there's an article on their website in which they quote, I'll just quote it verbatim, when researchers asked an army official in Nigeria if it was, local people or security forces or government officials involved in this network, he only said one word. He just said all, ALL, everybody, right? Which is, notable, I think. And again, that drives home the point that this issue is a symptom of a lot of problems converging, a lot of problems and a lot of factors converging. Oil supply, weak governance, people who need another way to make money to put food on the table, or opportunists who see an opportunity, and then easy access to where the demand is, and they can get the oil up out of the ground, or they can take it once it's already out of the ground. They can take it in crude, they can take it refined, and they can sell it to somebody else and make a buck on it. And that requires a lot of things: corruption, poverty, etc.
You touched on the point of poor governance being an issue, and I think this ties back into the questions I raised at the beginning of whether, specific to, I guess, ISIL, Daesh in Iraq and Syria, whether the oil networks are a symptom of a problem or a problem in themselves. Because if you ask, after Daesh is eradicated in some way, these oil networks will continue to exist to delegitimize regimes that come up in the empty space. And so at some point, we're going to need to tackle these oil networks as an issue within themselves so that they don't continue to serve as this illicit source of funding for other groups and delegitimizing the government systems.
That's an excellent point. Delegitimizing the government systems delegitimizing the networks can be a way to fight the system, and focusing on legitimizing, further legitimizing what should be legitimate governing systems should be a primary focus to not only this problem, but a lot of other problems that we discuss on this show. So let's try to brighten this up a little bit. I'm going to pass the mic off to Grace, who's going to bring a little bit of sunshine into this topic.
I'll try. Awesome. Thanks, Drew. Okay, so let's look at some statistics here. And Siree, I will draw you back in here. But it looks like, or some reports have shown, that U.S. airstrikes have actually cut production by 70,000 barrels per day. This was in 2014, or the end of 2014. But is this trend continuing? Are we seeing a stymieing of this trade by the efforts of the U.S. and its allies?
I would like to think so, because I take any statistics I see regarding Daesh with a grain of salt, because, where are these numbers coming from? That said, because it was the International Energy Agency that released this statistic about 70,000 barrels per day being cut from production. I think there are at least signs to show that they're slowing down. Also, you start seeing job postings by Daesh for
I saw that. Yeah.
for engineers and technicians, because they're not able to maintain the equipment of these large refineries on their own. And frankly, they need to be plugged into the international system in order to have access to those resources. So the question is, if this oil network, this illicit economy, is even sustainable. For example, a more recent situation is that the Iraqi government has been paying for the workers, the staff, like the typical government, ministry, and refinery staff, have been paying their normal salaries until last week. The central government of Baghdad just stopped paying them, and so ISIS will need to be able to start filling that space. I realize I'm going back and forth between ISIS and Daesh, but I hope everybody knows what I'm talking about.
So it looks like there is going to be a sustainability issue looking at being able to retain the high-skilled labor that is needed to facilitate this trade.
Absolutely. It's a matter of whether the network, the economy, the technical aspects are sustainable, but also whether Daesh's legitimacy if they can even continue, because at some point people under their governance will eventually realize that they can't provide as much as they say they can.
Well, hopefully that transition is a more peaceful one than the transition into the situation that we have now. Well, that's unfortunately running out of time. This has been a great conversation. Siree, thank you for joining us today.
You're welcome.
Grace,
it was a pleasure.
Always good to hear from you. Kevin, always good to chat with you. And once again, I'm Drew. For more information to see the articles that we were talking about, plus to see more sources that we used in informing ourselves about today's discussion, please visit our website at mattersofstate.org/episode 7. Tune in to us next week, and thank you for listening.
The aggregate of our joy and suffering, thousands of confident religions, ideologies, and economic doctrines, every hero and coward, every creator and destroyer of civilization, every teacher of morals, every corrupt politician, every superstar, every supreme leader, every saint and sinner in the history of our species lived there, on a mote of dust, suspended in a sunbeam. Think of the rivers of blood spilled by all those generals and emperors, so that in glory and triumph they could become the momentary masters of a fraction of a dot.